Hello, team players. Have you ever wanted to play a barbarian that can slow enemies down, not just through grappling, but also by actually lowering their speed or putting them in difficult terrain? Well, that's one of our goals as a Raging Spider Barbarian. We will be still doing massive damage because we are still a barbarian at the end of the day. But we want to do two things with this belt. We want to either force enemies to attack us with our massive HP, in the case of melee enemies, or we want them to waste actions trying to get away from us, in the case of ranged enemies. And we can absolutely do both of those things with this belt. So let's get into this. So, for our attributes, obviously our most important is going to be strength, for our damage and for our grappling and tripping. Next most important is going to be constitution. We need that massive HP and fortitude saves. And finally, dexterity. We are going to be taking an option that will require us to use our dexterity to attack. Also, having high AC on top of our massive HP is going to help as well. For skills, the only one you really need for this build is athletics. For tripping and grappling, of course. Luckily, as a barbarian, we get that automatically. Intimidation is also an effective choice if you've got decent charisma. Other than that, you can basically pick what you want. But if you've got at least decent intelligence or wisdom, some recall knowledge skills might be useful. For today's instinct, we're going to be going with the animal instinct, and we're going to be picking up, of course, the spider. The spider gives us a fangs unarmed attack that has the grapple and venomous traits, but more importantly, it gives us a web unarmed attack that has a range of 15 feet. The grapple trait on our fangs is going to be pretty important for this build. The venomous trait is nice, but it's not needed for this build. If you don't know, the venomous trait allows us to do persistent poison damage when we hit with our fangs, which is nice, but we don't need it. The grapple trait allows us to grapple with our fangs and get an item bonus. That's pretty important. For our webs, that has a range of 15 feet and allows us to, if we hit once, reduce the target speed by 10 feet, and if we hit twice, we can completely immobilize that creature. And if we slow them down, it makes it even harder for them to get away from us and our massive damage. And if we immobilize them, they're not going anywhere. They're stuck in the square that they're at. Which means if they don't escape on their turn, we can bite their face off with our fangs. And it also means that the rest of our melee fighters in the party can gang up on them, and our ranged attackers don't have to worry about them coming after them, which means they can use their ranged attacks all day long. Our first feat for this build is going to be Sudden Charge. With both of our main attacks, we're going to need to be pretty close to the enemy. That means we're either going to need to be right up next to an enemy for our fangs, or within 15 feet for our webs. And enemies might be a lot further away than that. So, this will allow us to get up to an enemy and use one of those attacks for 2 actions. And then we can use another attack if we want. This also means that enemies have a reason to attack us instead of our allies, as it's kind of hard to ignore the barbarian that is charging right at you. For our second feat, no escape is pretty much a no-brainer here, as we want our enemies to waste actions or attack us. This will allow us to move with our enemies if they try to get away from us. Remember that we're going to be slowing down and immobilizing enemies with our webs. This gives ranged attackers an incentive to get away from us, or melee attackers an incentive to maybe try to attack somebody else. Either way, if they're moving, we get to go after them. And this just makes us harder to ignore. And the harder we are to ignore, the more likely it is we can do our job, which is to keep enemies off our allies. For our next feat, we're going to be taking Oversized Throw. Our webs only have a range of 15 feet, and we're going to eventually run into flying enemies. This means we need an option to hit flying enemies that are out of our web's reach. This will allow us to throw an object of our size or smaller with a range increment of 20 feet rather than 15 feet. And this does good damage. But remember, this is not a melee attack, which means we don't get our rage damage. However, it is a thrown weapon attack, which means we do get to add our strength modifier. Very handy to have an option that we can use to hit enemies that are out of our reach. Next, we're going to take Animal Skin. So first of all, we are Animal Instinct, so we can take this. And it gives us Expert in Unarmored Defense about 7 levels early, which is flat out amazing. And it gives us AC as if we had breastplate armor, which is pretty amazing too. Plus, even though this is an item bonus, it does stack with Bonds of Force, any runes we have on our Explorer's clothing, and Mystic Armor. Great AC option here, and we are the Instinct that can take this, so we might as well take it. Furious Bully is a no-brainer here. Really, it's a +2 to every attack action that uses athletics. Tripping and grappling are two major parts of this build. Straight +2 to them. And remember, we're always going to have at least one hand free, because we're attacking with our fangs, which means that we can disarm people if we want to, even shove. No brainer here, absolutely should take this. For 10th level, we're going to take Friendly Toss. For 2 actions, we can essentially toss one of our allies up to 30 feet. This has 2 functions. First, it allows us to take ranged allies and get them away from melee attackers. Second, it allows us to get melee attackers, other melee attackers in our party, up to enemies without them having to spend a single move action. This does have the manipulate trait. However, if we're using this to get an ally away from a melee enemy, we take the reactive strike instead of them. Which is important, because we have the HP to take that, whereas the spellcaster does not. Or whatever ranged attacker probably does not. And if we use this to get a melee attacker up to an enemy, they get to hit them as a reaction, which is amazing. This is just getting allies where they need to be without them having to use an action, which is fantastic. This does take 2 actions on our part, but sometimes that's going to be beneficial. And we can still attack if an enemy's right next to us or move up. So this is still a great option. At 12th, it's Furious Grab. Now we get to automatically grapple someone for an action if we hit them. This effectively means that we can just automatically grab them, which is pretty darn amazing. Now you may be wondering why we're taking Furious Bully and Furious Grab. Well, grappling is a big part of this build, but that Furious Bully will still apply to tripping, shoving, and disarming. 3 things we can definitely still do with this build, since we will have hands free. Very, very good for this build. At 14th level, it's Embrace the Pain, which is a brand new one from Player Core 2. If an enemy hits us with a melee attack, we can spend a reaction to immediately make one athletics check to grapple or to disarm the creature of the weapon that they hit us with. This effectively means we can grapple or disarm on the opponent's turn. This means we don't have to grapple on our turn, and we can hit them with 2 webs and then do something else. And no multiple attack penalty since we're doing it on the opponent's turn. Fantastic feat here. Highly recommend for this belt. Alright, next up we have Come and Get Me. This does make you off guard and gives them a +2 bonus to hit you. But remember, we have good AC and we have massive hit points. And this gives enemies an incentive to attack us rather than our allies. And if the enemy does hit us, they're off guard to us, which makes it easier for us to hit with our fangs. And more importantly, use our Furious Grab. I do recommend this for this belt. For our level 18 feat, you can pretty much take what you want. However, there are certain feats that I would recommend for this belt. You can take Reactive Strike to hit enemies that try to get up after your trips. You could take Vengeful Strike to hit enemies that hit you when you're under Come and Get Me. Or you could even take Terrifying Howl if you've got decent charisma. But really just take what you want here. In the end, it really doesn't matter. But for our capstone, we absolutely want to take Quaking Stomp. This essentially gives us the effects of an Earthquake spell for 1 action. Earthquake does a lot. But what we're most interested in for this build is the difficult terrain it creates. As remember, we are lowering their speed and we're grappling them. We might even be immobilizing them, but that's not really important for this feat. If we can manage to grapple and web them once, they lose 10 feet of their movement for 1 round, and then they have to get out of their grapple. If we use this in addition to that, then their speed is also halved. This makes it near impossible to get away from us. This is definitely a feat we want to take, and it's definitely a great capstone. Highly recommend this feat for this belt. We're a barbarian, so no spells for this video, but I do want to talk about free archetype. Wrestler is an excellent archetype for this belt, as you'll be able to do a lot of really cool stuff while you have them grappled. Especially since Wrestler's been buffed in the remaster. Another good archetype for this build is Monk. We're not going to be wearing any armor because of animal skin, and that means we can take stuff like Mountain Stance. And it also means that if we have an opponent grabbed with our fangs, we can still punch them, which is fantastic. Also, speed is going to be pretty important for this build. So, Monk Moves is going to be a really good feat to take here. The last archetype I can recommend for this build is Rogue. We won't get much sneak attack with the Rogue dedication. However, we will be grappling a lot in this build. And also webbing up foes. If we can get them immobilized or grappled, that means sneak attack, because they'll be off guard. So, excellent option. And Rogue can also give us more skills if we want that. And if we've got decent intimidation, we can take Your Next and Dread Striker to make them even more off guard. Or we can take Head Stomp to hit enemies that are prone from our trips. There's quite a bit here. But that's all I can really recommend for free archetype. For items, the only things I can recommend are anything that increases your movement speed or gives you a fly speed. The movement speed is for when enemies try to get away from us. The faster we are, the more difficult it is for them to do so. The fly speed is for this. Put simply, we can web up an enemy with 2 actions and then fly up. Then we can just let go. Even if they have wings, they have to get out of our webs and become non-immobilized, otherwise they fall and take half of the distance as damage and land prone, which effectively means now everyone gets to attack them because it's the end of their turn. Fly speed will make this build extremely fun. Of course, there are other ways to get fly speed other than items, but we will talk about that in the ancestry portion of this video. Let's talk ancestries. So, obviously for all 3 of these ancestries I'm going to recommend, I am going to recommend you pick up a heritage that can give you flights. So, like Nephilim or Dragonblood. But I'm also going to recommend other heritages if you don't want to do that. So, the first ancestry that I recommend for this build is Dwarf. Yes, believe it or not, I do recommend Dwarf for this build. There's a few reasons. Yes, Dwarves do get lower speed. However, that's what the items are for. And you can take Fleet to increase your speed to normal. But there are a number of reasons to go Dwarf for this build. First, remember that Quaking Stomp feat, that creates rocky difficult terrain, which means you can take Rock Runner to completely ignore that. Which means if you have an enemy webbed up and in that rocky difficult terrain or any other rocky difficult terrain, you can move through that no problem. Whereas the enemy probably has a speed of 5 feet at this point. You still have to spend an action, but it makes it near impossible to get out of the difficult terrain. Even if they spend all 3 actions moving, you can move for 1 action. Back up to them. Which is flat out amazing. And there's another reason to go Dwarf too. Mountain Stoutness. Remember, you can combine Mountain Stoutness with Toughness. That means you can get even more HP than you already have. Which is, again, amazing. You can even take Boulder Roll to force enemies into difficult terrain, making this even better, or forcing them up against a wall so that they can't go anywhere even if you don't immobilize them. Dwarf is an amazing ancestry for this build. For heritage for Dwarf, I recommend the Rock Dwarf. This makes it even harder for them to move you around, trip you, whatever. They'll have a harder time doing to you what you're trying to do to them, other than grappling, of course, but still. The point is, making it harder for enemies to use the trip, shove, or reposition action against you is very good for this build. The second ancestry I recommend for this build is Orc. Orc can give you a lot too. You can take Orc Ferocity and that entire line of feats in order to stay up when you would go down. And you can take Bloody Blows to do even more damage with your fangs, because they're going to be taking persistent poison damage. And if you take Bloody Blows, they'll be taking persistent bleed damage too, which is pretty awesome. For heritage, if you don't take a flying heritage, then I would recommend you pick up Hold Scarred Orc. That's Die Hard for free and a little more hit points. Pretty nice. And that's going to do it for this build. If you guys enjoyed this build, go ahead and leave a like. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more Pathfinder 2e and in the future, Starfinder 2e teamwork content. If you're interested, you can join my Patreon page to get a Google Sheet for this build and all my other builds, as well as other perks, just like these people here. And leave me a comment. Let me know what you guys think of this build. All links are all in the description. If you're interested in another really good build, you can check out this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.